Rosatom, unlike a lot of Western countries, is fully integrated vertically. They have absolutely everything that they need, engineering, design, fuel, they have decommissioning, construction. They'll help you do absolutely everything. And if you try to look at a similar company, the closest you'll maybe get is maybe EDF and maybe KHNP, but they're not going to cover that full spectrum. They're not going to come in with full financing. They're not going to, help you fully set up the regulator. They're not going to do absolutely everything for you. Russia will come in and give you a turnkey, everything that you need, and they're very good at it.
A warm welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Michael Seeley, aka the Atomic Blender. I have no idea how it has taken on the order of 290 episodes for this matchmaking to occur. I've really admired Michael's work from afar. I thought he was Canadian. He has a great video on the Canadian nuclear sector, which I quite liked. He came across my feed, I guess. I've been really deep diving Rosatom recently and trying to understand this behemoth of an organization and how it operates. We did have an episode called The Russian Atom with Mark Nelson, who speaks fluent Russian, is quite good with Russian literature, and obviously knows the sector well. That was several years ago. We're back on topic, and Michael, you have an absolutely awesome video on the topic. We will link that. But I'm hoping to tease some more things out of that. First off, welcome. It's great to have you.
No, it's great to be here. I mean, I've been a fan of Decouple for quite a long time now. I think you guys do some excellent work and some deep dives, so happy to be a part of it here.
Awesome. Just fill in the blanks on your autobiography. You are more than the Atomic Blender.
That's true.
You have some expertise. I think you worked in the UAE most recently, but just fill us in on who you are, what you do.
Yeah, exactly. So I am a professional licensed nuclear engineer in the state of California, where I was briefly at the San Onofre plant. But I have about 2 decades of experience in the nuclear industry. Started out at Westinghouse in Pittsburgh, did some initial core design work there. Then went out to California to San Onofre before that plant was unfortunately shut down.
Rest in peace.
And then had the very brief time on an SMR project, the Babcock and Wilcox mPower plant. That was before SMRs, I think, were really popular. This was in the early 2010s. And then I got a really great opportunity to go out to the UAE and spent about a decade there from really just about first concrete pour through startup and criticality and commercial operation of the first 2 units. And there's 4 units now operating there. So it was a really good opportunity to see how nuclear power can come to a country that has no experience and goes from like zero to full, just almost like that. Over about the course of a decade, they managed to do it. And it's a really impressive story. And now I'm consulting. I live in Vienna, Austria. So yes, I am American. I live in Vienna, not Canadian. You're not the first person to think that I am Canadian. But I do enjoy talking about nuclear energy, and my time in Vienna kind of as an independent consultant gave me the opportunity to make Atomic Blender, the YouTube channel, and try and get out to the general public about pros, cons, everything, economics, technology, about nuclear energy. And it seems to have resonated pretty well with a fair number of people. And so really happy about that and really glad to be here to talk more about nuclear energy with you.
Yeah, it's a great channel, and it's refreshing because I feel like you have real kind of free editorial. It's rare in this space to find someone who can say it as it is and speak their mind. So appreciate the content. When you were talking about Baraka, the Decouple team toured there. We did a great. I won't necessarily call it a red carpet tour, but we got some nice station access. Got to spend some time with Marwan. I'm forgetting her last name if she's listening. Thank you. That was a wonderful tour. It's I've been to the Giza pyramids outside of Egypt. Like there's this kind of similar sense of wonder at these monolithic buildings like arising out of the desert. The whole complex, like more than 1 kilometer long, I believe, 5,600 megawatts. Fascinating place. And I guess arguably it's in the Western sphere, I guess, because it's using APR 1400 technology, which is licensed under combustion engineering and Westinghouse famously, but ties it into a kind of Western block. As someone from the West to actually see a project from first pour to criticality. We don't see that in the West very often. I mean, I guess maybe if you'd been at Vogel for a long time, that might have happened. But you have had a rare experience. Although I mean, lots of people are Westerners have worked at Baraka. Anyway, let's move on to what we're here to talk about today. My sort of takeoff point. I had a LinkedIn post on this recently. Reflecting on, trying to zoom out and get a sense of the state of the industry. And, we're in the midst, Mike, I'm not sure if you know it, but we're in the midst of a nuclear revival, man. And there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. There's a lot of, breathy, or breathless, I should say, media stories on this. There's a lot of investor interest. Nuclear stocks are pumped at this moment, no doubt about that. And there's not much happening. And we'll see what happens, but certainly there's a lot of hot air. And then, looking around the world at, who is actually building, it's them Ruskies, the Chinese, the Indians, responsible for, I don't know, I think it's like 50 of the 64 plants currently under construction. And so when you start actually crunching the numbers and looking at the various, not just vendors, right? But we'll talk about how Rosatom is more than just, a vendor in terms of how we conceive of it in the West. Just miles apart. The world's leading nuclear entity or company, I would argue, and I think you would agree. So let's dive in. What is Rosatom?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you make a really great point about the difference between the Western approach and what you could say is the Eastern approach and the Russian approach. And the Russians really have taken the approach to nuclear power building and the management of how that's done almost to a perfect point. The way that they've structured their company and the way that they do that is really second to none. But what do I mean by that? So Rosatom itself starts a little bit farther back. Really, Rosatom didn't actually exist until 2007, when Vladimir Putin kind of collected together a bunch of state enterprises and state companies, and seeing an opportunity, really put those together under one company, and that company became called Rosatom. And at that point, Rosatom really was only responsible for a lot of the kind of historical projects that had existed, the existing plants in Russia and in Eastern and Central Europe, the VVERs mostly, and a few remaining RBMKs. But what Rosatom did after that, under the guidance of a new guy named Sergei Kirienko or something like this. My Russian is not so good, so please bear with me. But what he did is he started to look at, okay, what can Rosatom and the Russian government do in terms of organizing a company? And they saw that they had a lot of experience. They had been running these plants for a long time, and the technology was quite unique. But what they did differently was start reaching out internationally to a lot of these newcomer countries that had not been in nuclear before, or they had nuclear technology and it was already Russian. And so what they started to do was say, okay, if we're going to expand internationally, we can do that in a way that really has been done before. Like the US has done sort of similar programs through Atoms for Peace, but not at the level that Russia was going to do it at. Russia then said, okay, we'll come into a newcomer country. We'll provide absolutely everything that they need in order to get started. We'll provide the technology, we'll provide the construction, we'll provide the operations, we'll provide the fuel, we'll provide the financing, we'll help you set up the regulator. We'll do absolutely everything you need to do to go from zero to full. And really, it's turnkey for you. If you don't want to be involved, that's okay too. You just take the electricity out of the plant that we own and operate, and you get a nuclear power plant, so you get the bragging rights of that. But what that did then is you have a bunch of countries that maybe weren't so sure about nuclear before. It becomes accessible to them. And on one hand, that's really a good thing, I would say. Nuclear energy being more available is a positive. And so you have countries like Egypt and Bangladesh, these newcomer countries that really haven't had anything before. They've maybe had small research reactors, but now they have access to something that they didn't have before. And this is a full-blown nuclear power plant built by the Russians, who have experience doing this. They've been doing it for decades. They didn't take a big pause like the Western countries did. There's no 20, 30-year pause like there was in the US. They've been continuously doing this. They've been continuously operating. And they come in and they say, yeah, we'll do it for you. And not only that, we'll do it at a price that you really can't refuse. And so it's a fantastic opportunity. And so Rosatom, in that sense, unlike a lot of Western countries, is fully integrated vertically. They have absolutely everything that they need, engineering, design, like I said, fuel, they have decommissioning, construction. They'll help you do absolutely everything. And if you try to look at a similar company, the closest you'll maybe get is maybe EDF and maybe KHNP, but they're not going to cover that full spectrum. They're not going to come in with full financing. They're not going to, help you fully set up the regulator. They're not going to do absolutely everything for you. Russia will come in and give you a turnkey, everything that you need, and they're very good at it.
Yeah, it sounds like the kind of ultimate customer service experience when it comes to the nuclear world. There's so many points to sort of take off from there. During the collapse of the Soviet Union and the sort of then collapse of democracy afterwards, and the oligarchization of the economy. Right, like I guess there were certain strategic industries, the oil and gas industry. I mean, there's a bunch of oligarchs kind of running that, but they're kept under, I think the thumb of the Russian state, the thumb of Putin. So was the nuclear industry just like of such strategic importance that it was sort of salvaged from the kind of vulture capitalism that sort of looted all of the kind of impressive state-owned companies that were often, sold off for a pittance to oligarchs or even foreign investors. I'm just curious because I think, Russia lost a lot of its heavy industry capacity during those years. There's certainly a big sort of, I think, national wound to the national pride, living through the fall of communism and just how, they thought communism was bad towards the end. What they got as a replacement for 10 years was just maybe worse. I'm just curious about that critical transition period. And it's 2007 that you said it comes together. So there must have been, a period in which there was some struggles, and there was also, megatons to megawatts. So there was kind of some stuff going on there. Maybe we can deep dive that a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you said, there's a huge period here of about maybe 15 years between the end of the Soviet Union in the early 90s up to about 2007. And a lot of these predecessors to Rosatom, some of them were controlled by the oblasts, the individual states. Some were under the federal government. Some of the factories are, over here. They become privatized, maybe not. The individual components kind of get scattered at the fall of the Soviet Union. And like you said, the Russian state is really hurting for money at that point. And one of the ways that it's actually the US that proposes it is something you mentioned, the Megatons-to-Megawatts program. And this is a way that the Russian government can actually make some money. So what is that program? That program takes old uranium from warheads or uranium that is ready to go into nuclear warheads, and usually it was downblended at the site in Russia and then shipped to the US. And so it became a way for the US to get access to cheap enriched uranium ready to go into nuclear reactors, because it's UO2 is UO2. Doesn't matter if it used to be 90% enriched and now it's down to 3, 4, 5%. It'll work just fine. And that actually became kind of a dumping on the US market for uranium, suppresses the price. But the Russians, they don't really care that much, right? They need money. And this is a way for them to get it. They're sitting on a ton of this resource, and they're happy to sell it to the US and get some money out of that. But there are a few side effects from this. One is it pushes down the price of uranium a lot. And so in the mid-90s, early 2000s, the price of uranium is cheap. It's $20 a pound, $10 a pound. For reference, nowadays it's around $80 to $100 a pound. But that means that a lot of the mining activity, particularly in the US, can't compete with that. The uranium mining in the US is not competitive at such a cheap price, the U.S. mines end up closing, and the U.S. becomes dependent on importing sources of uranium. And so at, I think around the peak, it was around 10 to 15% of U.S. Electricity was being, or nuclear electricity was being generated from this Megatons-to-Megawatts program, subsidized by the Russian government. What this also does, though, for the Russian government is, besides giving the money, is it gives them market share. It starts to build out the networks. You have to start shipping the stuff. You start to then need the equipment and the mechanisms and the measuring and the calibration and all of that. The international protocols for everything needs to be built out. And that gets done during this program. And so by the time we get around to 2007, when the program starts winding down, the material starts to run out, Rosatom then, as it starts to form, says, okay, well, we can start to fill the supply by getting new material. We'll start looking at uranium mines, we'll start looking at enrichment, and then it's over the next 10 years or so that Russia then starts to backfill this supply that it used to be giving with its own technology. It builds its own centrifuges, it builds its own conversion facilities, and because it has already made the inroads into the market with such this cheap supply, it's very easy for them to just kind of swap over and say, okay, yeah, well, the price is going up a bit, but you already have contracts with us, you already have the logistics, you already know how it works, we're reliable, and we're here for you. We'll do that. And that's how Rosatom then kind of slowly takes over the nuclear fuel market.
Yeah, that is a fascinating story. And, it's this fascinating kind of Francis Fukuyama end of history moment. This bipolar Cold War is now over, and it's sort of the age of, fairly brief, I guess, blink of an eye as we look back now. But in the moment, this was American hegemony, the world's sole superpower. And, just interesting how, industrial policy starts to really fall away. The market is going to take care of everything. We start selling off our rare earth element and minor metal stockpiles because the market's going to do a better job. And really everyone's kind of like a kind of globalization kumbaya with the U.S. sort of comfortably in charge. And you can look at megatons to megawatts in a variety of different lights. And in one sense, like, as a nuclear advocate, it's like one of the most incredible swords to plowshare stories out there. I mean, the sheer volume of, potential warheads that went into, peaceful, ultra low carbon electricity in the U.S. is pretty astounding. But as you said, it completely gutted uranium mining and uranium enrichment. We have a great episode, Enriching Uranium Understanding, with James Krallenstein, which goes a little bit into this kind of schizophrenic approach in the U.S. where centrifuge cascades were built, and because they were sort of private market actors, the centrifuges, when this megatons to megawatts program happened, prices were gutted, and rather than having to go through the regulatory burden of signing off on all the licensing documents, that this is a pain in the ass, took out all these newly built centrifuges, scrapped them, buried them in a desert. So quite a story there, but Russia, you have to update us maybe, but because there's been recent chatter and legislation trying to get away from the use of Russian fuel, both in Europe and the U.S. But the U.S., 1/3 of its enrichment services from Europe, 1/3 from Russia, 1/3 domestic. Last we covered it about a year ago, and I think that is shifting. The Sapporo agreement, et cetera. But yeah, fill us in a little bit on that. We won't get too down this road, but I think it is a vital part. And as you mentioned, this sort of provides maybe some of the seed capital and the business case to pull together the 300 subsidiaries that now make up Rosatom.
Yeah, exactly. So, to your point, a couple of years ago now, after Ukraine, and even more recently, there's been a number of executive orders out of the U.S. That have basically said, okay, this dependence on Russian uranium is not acceptable. And so I think the target was end of 2024, end of 2025, there's going to be no more Russian uranium in the United States, right? That's the direction from the U.S. government, except unless you already have contracts and you can't really find another supplier, and that's what's happened, right? So there's a number of exemptions that have been granted for suppliers. I mean, these are big companies, the major nuclear operators in the U.S. that are supposed to be getting off of Russian uranium. There's really no alternative, and that really speaks to where Russia is in the market. Even with an order from the U.S. government to stop buying Russian uranium, yes, it has decreased it, some of the more marginal contracts, ones that are expiring. But are we going to go and tell Constellation and Duke Energy that, okay, no, you're going to get a half a supply of uranium that you used to get, and you're going to need to shut those down? And so that's, exactly how the supply of uranium ties back into, you could call it national security or energy security, that even with orders like that, and even with attempts to try and diversify, these companies really don't have any other choice in the US. There's no other suppliers. You have a couple in Europe, they're at capacity. The one in the US doesn't nearly even cover the US supply. So you have to get it from somewhere. And that's just the way it is.
Yeah. And of course, Rosatom also manages, some of its subsidiaries help to manage the Russian nuclear weapon stockpile. So every time you're buying some Russian uranium, you're making a little charitable contribution to your adversary's nuclear weapons program. Okay, well let's park the enrichment side, but that is huge. I think 46% of the world's separative work units come out of Russia. So a major player in this game. You mentioned again this tricky period, this transition from kind of Soviet collapse to some kind of authoritarian rebirth with Putin. And I was looking at VVER construction schedules because I was very interested. This is the pressurized water reactor technology of the Russians, and it's one of the reactor technologies that has been built at a whole variety of different scales. Like I think the early ones, like 165, 240, 365, 440, a grand, 1,200 megawatts output. And so I've always been curious, like, well, were the 440s built like way faster or not? And anyway, in doing this research, you see some of the reactors took forever to build, but those are the ones that weathered the collapse. So they were under construction, paused. But as you said, otherwise there's been a real consistency to the sort of state capacity and the capacity of the entities that became Rosatom. There wasn't this atrophy and this pause. And again, just looking historically, like Westinghouse at its peak, I think maybe was outdoing Rosatom in terms of maybe having 30, 40 simultaneous projects around the world involved in the French builds, finishing up a bunch of builds that started pre-TMI that sort of carried on. I think had around 120, 130,000 employees at their peak. But they're down, I was looking at this, Michael, they're down to like 11,000 employees, right? They used to have in-house turbine, in-house EPC. They used to deliver turnkey projects. And just that delta, and I think this is what really, I find this story to be so compelling and so illustrative as the West has these big kind of puffy ambitions now, and we're going to triple nuclear energy by 2050, 300 gigawatts or 200 gigawatts of new nuclear in the US by 2050. And you look at, well, like, who could deliver that? And you look at Rosatom and you're like, well, they're delivering, I think 20 reactors simultaneously in 6 countries right now. Even that's not, 200 reactors by 2050. I'm on a rant here, but to talk a little bit more again about that, just that extraordinary delta that we're seeing, or really, I ask these ridiculous, monologue-y questions. So you can really take it from anywhere you like from that diatribe.
No, that's an absolutely great point. And you're completely right about Westinghouse and, some of the other companies that existed at the time, Babcock and Wilcox, GE Hitachi, well, GE before, now GE Hitachi. They used to be in the, we'll say 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, these massive vertically integrated companies. Still not quite to what we're talking about with Rosatom, but you could more or less get everything you needed. You go to Westinghouse and you say, I need someone to build all the auxiliaries, design all of the support, the electrical, the turbine, everything, get it all up and running. And now if you go to Westinghouse, you're not going to get that, right? You're going to get nuclear island, some of the supporting information, maybe some INC, and then maybe some other components, but you're not going to get the full thing. And Rosatom really, with all of its subsidiaries, it can do all of that. It does still sometimes subcontract out things like the turbine. Turbines tend to be quite specialized, and depending on the market that they're entering, they may not have the exact expertise for that. So sometimes they'll contract like the French, but generally you're going to get everything from Rosatom. So, if you start at the very beginning, you need civil works and civil design. Rosatom has a subsidiary that does that. I'm not even going to attempt to start to try and remember and name all of them.
Please try and pronounce that.
but there's just so many of them, and they all have a little specialty, and they all do that, and they're all under this corporate umbrella. And I'm using the word corporate in a kind of a strict legal sense. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit later about what Rosatom actually is structured like. But they have all of...
Before you do, you have this great thing where you kind of simplify again for a non-nuclear audience or nuclear enthusiast, layperson audience. It's this analogy of buying a car and how that's the Rosatom experience. So let's go to the Rosatom dealership and let's compare that to the Westinghouse dealership.
Yeah, so let's say we're a country and we're excited. We see the nuclear wave coming and we want to get a nuclear plant. So, okay, let's go shopping. We go to the dealership and we have two choices. We have the Western, we'll just say Western. We won't say Westinghouse or GE or whatever. It's just a Western dealership. And we have Rosatom. And we walk in to the dealership with the Western dealership and they say, great, we're glad you're interested. Here we can sell you, they show a car on the display and it looks great. And you're like, okay, fantastic. I like your background, your technology. It looks safe. Everything's good. And they're like, okay, well, really, we can only sell you the engine though. If you want the full thing, the doors and the wheels and the brakes and the air conditioning and the windshield and the tail lights, yeah, you're going to have to go get those from somebody else. We don't sell you that. And so now you're like, oh, okay. Well, do you have a list of suppliers or recommendations? Like, yeah, here's a list. Go, good luck. And so then you have to go out and talk to your brake light supplier and see like, yeah, we sell brake lights. We might have to design something for you if you have this kind of car. Maybe we can make it work. We'll have to talk to the supplier. You'll need to have a 3-way contract in order to share information. And you have to do that then with a whole bunch of components. You have to do that then with the brakes. You have to do that with the wheels. You have to do it with the wires that run from the steering column all the way down to the engine itself. I mean, you have to start as a customer, especially first time, you have to start doing all of these little legwork things, make sure everything works, make sure the contract terms, you're not, getting screwed over on something, taking on extra liability, make sure that you have financing for all of it, make sure that you have everything lined up. It's a real pain. So, I mean, if you're going to go buy a car like that, nobody would buy a car like that today. If you tried to get people, maybe a few people like project kit cars and something like that, people who like getting their hands dirty. But if you wanted to just buy a car and go, it's a really difficult journey to do it with the West. If we then go over to the Rosatom dealership and we say, wow, we like this car. I mean, it's fine. It's, it's good. It runs. It'll get me from point A to point B. And they're like, okay. And you're like, well, don't I need to go get the wheels and the brakes? No, it's all included. Everything's included. We'll drive it to your house. We'll show you how to operate it, or we'll drive you around. We'll provide a driver for you. We'll include the regular maintenance. We'll come fill it up. And the tailpipe emissions, we'll even take the emissions out of the back when we're done. And we'll help you clean it up and keep it running the whole time. And so as a newcomer country, and if you're looking at that offer, and they're also like, well, we'll also give it to you at 0% interest, below market rate. I mean, how can you say no to that? I call it the Rosatom mafia offer. There's no way that the Western companies can compete against this kind of offer. It includes absolutely everything. They'll help you do everything that you need to do and get you up and running and out the door. And they have been doing it over the last 10, 20 years, pretty much continuously. Like you said, they have all these projects going on. They have more or less a standard design. They will customize it a little bit, but the VVER, PWR is nothing really that special. It works. It produces electricity. So what's not to like? As a newcomer, you're like, well, why? Why would you choose anything else?
So a couple things there. This sounds lovely and almost like charity, which it's decisively not. There's soft power reasons why countries engage in nuclear exports beyond making money. Exporting nuclear plants can, especially the construction, if it doesn't go well, can be a huge loss leader, shall we say. But talk about what's the underlying rationale in terms of the payback to Russia, financial and diplomatic, and from a soft power perspective, and also like where the hell do they get the money from? Because these are expensive projects. They generate income. They must. But yeah, just talk a little bit about those two subjects.
Yeah, I'll get the second point first. So the projects, and where does Russia get the money from? Russia gets the money from state treasury. So Rosatom has direct access, and it's in their charter as a company to get money from the Russian federal government, so they can go and write loans for any of these projects. Russia in the 90s, of course, very poor, doesn't have money, starts to get money from uranium, but really from gas exports. And so Russian gas supplies the Russian treasury. Russian treasury supplies these nuclear projects overseas. And so that's where the money ultimately comes from. But your soft power point is really where this starts to come in. So why is Rosatom being so generous? Why are they giving, zero interest or near zero interest loans for decades that are going to countries that maybe the stability of the currency isn't so great and the economy isn't so great? But sure, we'll give you a $20 billion loan at 0.5% for 3 decades, and no problem. So why do they do this? What it really does is Rosatom, at the face of it, looks like any other kind of private company. You have this kind of post-capitalism movement coming out of Russia. Rosatom technically is under that, but not really. It's a non-commercial entity under the Russian government. So they don't actually have to make any money. They do make money, but they don't have to. What they really are is an extension of the Russian government. And Russia, just like the United States did under Atoms for Peace in the 1950s and 60s, knows that when you build a nuclear power plant overseas, there is a very long-term contract. Whether that contract is actually written on paper or not, there is a long-term contract between your country and the country that is building the nuclear power plant. But why is that? So the technology that is in the plants is quite complex, and it's often very unique to the actual design of the plant and to the people who did that design. If we look at places like Turkey or Egypt, Bangladesh, are they taking the technology from Russia? There's Russian plants being built in all of those places. Is there technology transfer going between Russia and the local population? Some, yes, but certainly not everything. Even in countries that have had Russian technology for decades, if you look in Eastern Europe, in like Ukraine and Slovakia, they have Russian plants, but they don't have the Russian technology. They know how to operate them. They know how to do basic maintenance. But particularly the fuel is tightly controlled and dependent on Russia. And I don't just mean the uranium. I mean the actual physical fuel design, the metal cages that hold the fuel together that go inside the reactor. And what that means is that if you want to diversify away from Russia, it's very difficult. You have to get somebody else to design that exact same type, or at least a similar enough type of fuel. And the physical dimensions have to match, the performance has to match, you have to do testing, you have to convince your regulator that, okay, this new supplier of fuel is going to be acceptable. And that is not a quick process. Unlike the car analogy where you can just, go to a different gas station, nuclear fuel in its final form is highly technical, highly specialized, and requires a lot of work in order to be able to use it. It's quite often a decade-long process to change from one to another. And that's something that you have to then be looking that far ahead to know that you want to do. So if we look at the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, a lot of Eastern reactors started looking at, okay, can we get fuel from somewhere else? And they started looking at Westinghouse and to a lesser extent into Framatome. And it's still taking them time. There are some initial deliveries coming through. They've gone through a little bit of an expedited process. But what Rosatom has done is they have embedded the technology of themselves overseas into these plants, and then but they basically have a beachhead or like a castle that they've built over in these countries that is a little bit of a ground where Rosatom and Russia itself is now planted. They will always need their expertise, and they will just be there forever. And that's just part of the reality of how Rosatom has structured itself and how it does these projects. And that's why they're offering these things at reduced rates, because Russia knows that if they go in, they build a plant in Bangladesh, and they sign especially a 60-year contract for maintenance, operation, and fuel, they now have a castle in Bangladesh, a castle in Egypt, a castle in Turkey, a NATO country that they can hold on to for decades.
You forwarded me a documentary by ARTE. It's a German. I'm not sure if apparently they're quite anti-nuclear, and it was a it's important to watch documentaries to give you a little bit of cognitive dissonance. But I think it was the broad sweep of it was essentially trying to expose European business ties with fuel, and to some degree, as you mentioned, I think Annabelle or EDF or Framatome, some entity was providing turbines maybe to the Egyptian Al Daba plants. And they were trying to make a kind of bit of a shockumentary about that. But there was, really interesting content, really good interviews, and it really kind of dug into, again, these relationships with, sub-chapters like the trap, etc. Again, I'm sort of infusing with a bit of bias, but I think it's really worth checking out. We'll put it in the show notes. But yeah, the story of Turkey is interesting. A NATO country, as you mentioned, with now a castle or an embassy or almost like some foreign territory that's kind of theirs in some way, not formally diplomatically. Apparently, they're also getting offered like a little port facility. Maybe they can park a warship there. They recently lost begins with a T, but they lost their Syrian base of operations when Assad was toppled. So this is like another little spot on the Mediterranean that might come in kind of handy. But yeah, like that is maybe surprising that a NATO country is doing that. And I guess it speaks to just what a good freaking deal the Russians can offer.
Yeah, I mean, how good of a deal does it have to be for a NATO country? And this is before Ukraine, but how good of a deal does it have to be for a NATO country to accept a Russian plant being built right inside? And yeah, I mean, you're right. There is a port, as any kind of large construction project would have. I don't know how much actually the Russian military would ever be able to actually use that, if Turkey would step in and say no. But Rosatom is a major owner, if not the largest owner now of the Turkey project. So legally, within the government of Turkey, pending some sort of intervention from the actual Turkey government themselves, Rosatom, and by extension Russia, has control over a asset that is for security or energy security within the country. And they're planning on building another one. And it's, again, most likely going to be another Russia project. Because by all accounts, the Turkey project, although it has had some issues, there's been some sanctions. I think Siemens has boycotted a portion of it. And so then the Russians are having to kind of, work around with their own technology to kind of backfill that part. But the offer that Rosatom is giving is so good that NATO countries are willing to take on their technology and take on the little, not quite embassy, but a little piece of Russian almost territory within their borders. And if you extend that a little bit further, and when we're talking about building up, triple nuclear energy by 2050, all these grand plans, I mean, if you really want that to happen, there's a few that have the experience and demonstration to do that. Rosatom is one. Arguably, the Koreans and the Chinese would be next in line. But do you think that there is any way in Canada, in the US, that if Rosatom comes in and says, yeah, we'll build 20 nuclear power plants over the next 5 years, would anybody actually take that? It would be a serious offer. I'm sure they would be happy to go in and do it. Maybe they'd be worried about nationalization or confiscation after construction is done. But the Americans would not be able to operate the Russian plant. They would still be reliant on the Russians, and that's exactly what the strategy is.
Let's talk a little bit. You mentioned like sanctions. Obviously, those have been quite severe since the Crimea takeover, and obviously since the Ukrainian conflict kicked off, the aggression in Ukraine. How has that impacted these projects? One would expect that this could be a real shock, and that countries, despite being able to drive the car off the parking lot, the metaphorical parking lot, that this represents a significant risk. How has that manifested? Are the projects crippled and falling behind schedule because they can't get parts, or as you mentioned, Siemens is boycotted, or maybe there's pressure on Annabelle not to provide that turbine? What's the story there?
Yeah, so in Europe, there has been some pushback, obviously, against Rosatom because of what's happened first in Crimea and then more recently in Ukraine more broadly. There has been, even before that, a little bit of attempt to diversify away from Rosatom. And the Czech Republic was actually one of the first to try and do this. In the early 2000s, I think, the Czech plant, Temlin, started looking to Westinghouse to be able to be a fuel supplier. So the plant was looking to diversify away from Rosatom, away from Tavel. And Westinghouse had never designed VVER fuel before and did make some initial deliveries. And the fuel, I'll be honest, did not perform well. It was twisting, it was bending, it was having kind of these vibration problems where the cladding of the fuel starts to wear away. And it took Westinghouse the better part of a decade to get a design that was working in the Russian style plants, this hexagonal style fuel. And to their credit, that has actually turned out to be a good thing for Westinghouse, because this means now that you have, after Crimea and you have after the broader invasion of Ukraine, a whole bunch of nuclear power plants that are Russian designed that are now looking like, can we get some fuel? And Westinghouse is saying, well, we have a design that probably will work. It'll still take a few years, for your specific plant, but we can start to switch you over. So Europe in general has been looking as fast as possible to diversify away. Most of Europe, Hungary maybe less so, but most of Europe has started to look at how can we get out from under Rosatom. Outside of Europe, though, it's a completely different story. Outside of Europe, you wouldn't think anything had happened. Maybe there were some discussions in rooms about maybe security of supply. If Russia gets attacked, we'll need an additional source of supply and support. But projects more or less have continued. There's been very little delay. I just checked before this one, the project in Bangladesh, their first nuclear plant. They have 2 units coming online. Originally was supposed to come on at the end of 2024, now scheduled for the end of 2025, a 1-year delay, which in nuclear is not so bad. And they're continuing. And Russia is now also continuing to bid on new projects. They've won recently a bid, I think it was in Kazakhstan. They're looking in Uzbekistan. Of course, these are much more in their sphere of influence, but they're also talking with India. They have under construction in India and looking to build more. They have projects in China. They have the ongoing project like in Egypt that I mentioned. And they have, even outside of that, smaller projects in South America and Mongolia. They have stuff all over. So Europe, yes. US, yes. Impacts from sanctions and limitations, but those were generally not their big new markets for expansion. Rosatom was trying, their initial project to try and get into the West was in Finland, and this was a couple of years ago. They were trying to build a single VVER 1200, I think. And officially, that project was not canceled because of Ukraine. It was canceled because of performance issues. And there is an argument to be made that that is the case. The Finnish regulator and technical body is notoriously difficult to work with. But Russia's first attempt coming into the West, this was supposed to be their demonstration project that, look, we can build in the West as well. And for them, that would have been an absolutely huge opportunity for Rosatom, because you have a lot of aging plants. Now we have a lot of interest in expanding nuclear, and Rosatom would be well positioned then to say, look at our project in Finland, successful. We can do it in your country too. And that now obviously has not happened. So Russia is a little bit closed off from the Western markets, but Asia, they're still strong.
Okay, so on that sort of sanctions and kind of recent geopolitics front, I don't think we can have this conversation without talking about Zaporizhzhia. So again, former Soviet bloc country. I have friends who say, well, yes, Chernobyl Unit 4 melted down, but the other 3 units ran until essentially the EU forced Ukraine to stop running them in exchange for giving them a bunch of money to build, new nuclear plants. Still a country that's, I believe, 50% plus nuclear, but maybe not anymore because it lost 5,000 megawatts or so at Zaporizhzhia. So you don't need to tell the whole story there, but maybe just a little update or what's going on. I understand Rosatom is now running the plant, although I think the plant's not running. So just help us understand the latest on that one.
Yeah, exactly. Zaporizhzhia is a really interesting case of how Rosatom has become more directly than they have in the past involved with Russian politics. Before, Rosatom was kind of at least masquerading as a legitimate business coming around saying, yeah, we'll offer you a plant and we'll do all these things for you, finance it and all these things. Now with Ukraine and we'll call it capture of the Zaporizhzhia plant, Rosatom has kind of been thrust onto the front of the political argument as well. I mean, they've always been there, but now they're really kind of on the front, because when Russia took over that part of Ukraine and the plant, the continued and safe operation, I would say, of the plant is going to be necessary. And really, that plant, like all VVRs in Eastern Europe, are dependent upon Russia. And what that means then is that Rosatom comes in and says, okay, you don't have the personnel, or they're unwilling to work, or they're unable to work, or for whatever reason. So Rosatom is going to take over the plant, and we're going to make sure that it's safe and it's ready to go. However, it's kind of a funny thing, because, you expect Rosatom in Russia to be able to operate essentially their own plant. But one of the things that Ukraine had started doing was transitioning fuel, among other things, their suppliers away from Rosatom after the Crimea invasion. So they've had about 8 to 10 years to prepare, and they've started diversifying away. And when Rosatom got there, they couldn't really do everything that they needed to do, because the plant had been modified by the workers in Ukraine. And so the plant right now is basically sitting idle. They can't quite start it up. They need support from really Westinghouse and some other Western suppliers, and they're certainly not going to assist Rosatom on a plant that's arguably not theirs. And at that point, the plant just sits idle. So it's not a great situation. It is certainly, I'm sure it's causing problems in Ukraine for their electricity supply. There's been, despite warnings from IEA and international commentators, and political bodies, that military action should not be anywhere near a nuclear power plant, and I completely agree with that. There still have been, drones. There's been shelling attacks and damage. The IEA has gone and done multiple visits where they've actually looked at physical damage to the actual plants. You can see where concrete has been blown off of buildings, and thankfully nothing critical has been hit. And with the plants in a shutdown state, it is a lot better, but it is not a great situation to be in, for sure.
So Nord Stream is obviously a massive piece of energy sabotage, and we can have different theories as to who carried it out. But I understand as well that the cooling water for Zaporizhzhia depended upon a big dam that I think got blown out, and I'm not sure who done it. Whether it was the Russians to make Zaporizhzhia unusable to the Ukrainians, or the Ukrainians to make Zaporizhzhia unusable to the Russians. But that sounds like an issue. And that was, wild story, because I think it's a pretty massive, wide, shallow river. It exposed a whole bunch of like World War II war material and corpses and things. Like, it sounded really macabre, but we don't need to dive into that. But I did think that was interesting. It sounds like that plant is not coming back online without some major efforts, which are unlikely to occur in a wartime environment.
Yeah, I don't think Zaporizhzhia is coming back anytime soon. It would be very difficult for them to do so unless the Russians do some sort of complete takeover where they uninstall the modifications and put it back the way they could. So a decision that they would have to make. One of the things that, same stories that came out around that time is that they were forcing the Ukrainian workers at gunpoint to go in and do it, or, we're going to, do horrible things to you and your family, sort of thing. So and these are allegedly Rosatom employees that are forcing them to do this. These are not Russian soldiers that are saying this. Allegedly, this is coming from Rosatom employees. So, like I said, this is kind of the first time that Rosatom is being put politically on the front lines that they're not really being used to.
Okay, well, let's leave Ukraine behind. Again, like I sort of say, like, Russia and China are where like Western nuclear dreams go to come true. Russia does have some what I call Generation 0, but some people call Generation 4 reactor concepts, and that have actually been under sustained development and operations, and even commercial operations in the case of their sodium fast reactor series. But I think they've got sort of the investment profile right, where the majority of the funds and corporate activities are going into proven, standardized PWR technology, and then there's innovation around the margins. We've that in China as well now with their high temperature gas reactors and some molten salt reactors and other experimental reactor technologies that they're developing. Seems like they kind of have the mix right, but also on the SMR front, this is something I found really fascinating. again, 400 reactors of operation of the icebreaker fleet, the iteration of their icebreaker reactor technology into an integral PWR. I've been informed that no, NuScale was not sort of the first company to create an integral PWR. I think actually my nuclear friends found a few other examples, but like significant advancement here. And in terms of all of the SMR hype that's out there, Russia's actually doing it and has done it, and looks like they're going to be scaling up a lot more in the Russian Arctic on the Northern Sea route. But also, I think the Uzbekistan deal is for
an SMR as well,
a rhythm reactor. So, can you talk a little bit about the SMR program? Or again, take my long meandering questions, and you can pick whatever you want to as a starting point.
I think you're absolutely right in that Russia has, like I said at the very beginning of this, they've really perfected their approach to doing this, and part of that is, of course, R&D. And going into new technologies that maybe aren't being done so much. So we have the bulk of their operations, 90%, whatever, maybe 95%, around supporting traditional PWR, their VVER fleet, and a couple of the other older plants. But majority of their VVER fleet is where they're going. That's what they're building abroad, with the exception of the new SMR. But they do have a few other plants that they've been working on, the sodium fast reactor, lead fast reactor. They have molten salt that they're exploring, both on floating type of plant and on land. And they have the icebreaker fleet that they've been operating now for many, many years. So to say that they're just focusing on existing technology doesn't really make sense. They are continuing to innovate. They are continuing to try and get new designs out there. And personally, one of my favorite things about them is that they do have the working fast reactors, and not just small prototypes. They have big ones, like I think it's the BN 800 or something. It's 800 megawatt fast reactor, and absolutely I'm fascinated by this sort of thing. And and I think there's only a couple of small startups in like Italy and Belgium that have looked at like liquid metal cooled fast reactors on that kind of scale. But the Russians have actually done it. And the BN 800 isn't even their first one. It's a larger version of their BN 600 that they've operated for many years. So if you're looking for experience and data, which a lot of these SMR companies are, the Russians actually have a lot of it. They're probably not going to be willing to share it with a lot of these Western startup countries. Maybe they will. Maybe for the right price, they'll do it. But the Russians really have a lot of technology that in the U.S. and Western countries, for us, it's just paper reactors. They're ideas based off of EBR2 that we could, go in and try and do something similar to that. We'll rely on data from 50 years ago. The Russians can go and make new data right now. They can take out hot samples and look at corrosion rates under any kind of conditions that you want from a real reactor. And they're putting it to good use. They haven't really done it so much for in production cases. I mean, the BN 800 is in production, but it's kind of a dual purpose plant. But their floating SMR is currently powering an isolated city, providing heat to a city basically in Siberia. And it provides them everything that they need. And it's not a super complicated thing to do. But the important thing is that they've done it. They've gained the experience from doing that. And then they can apply that to the next step. Whereas in the US and the West, we're still thinking about, well, maybe we should change it to this. Well, I don't know. Let's argue. Let's set policy and that sort of thing. And I'm not saying that the Russian approach is superior, but it certainly is getting results in the direction that I think a lot of people would like to go in terms of actually getting things built.
It's interesting. I would state just that it is superior. I mean, I'm not going to speak to sort of like the moral consequences of what's happening in Zaporizhzhia, but from a strictly sort of business development sense, exporting reactors, getting them built, farting around at the edges of nuclear technology. Trying to think about how you would create the Western Rosatom. It is beyond the capacity of any one country nowadays. France, again, I think I call it sort of the hubris of the now, where we're we have AI and we know how to code, and GDP is a lot bigger now. In the 70s and 80s they had slide rules. If they did it then, we can do it now. And it's just we can't. We didn't. We had that. We had some of that. What we're talking about here. And with nuclear, I'm always thinking about I have this framing of different energy sources, and I'm like, solar panels are bicycles, and wind turbines are cars, and you can sort of work your way up. And nuclear power plants are like freight trains, right? Where you got to lay down the tracks. You got to survey the land first, lay down the tracks, build the locomotives, build the rail cars, organize massive companies, et cetera, in order to do all this. So there's this kind of static friction. I'm just using some sort of physics and chemistry language here to try, and I don't have better words for this, but you need some activation energy. Like for combustion, you need a certain amount of activation energy to get the flame going. This is the kind of thing that's required. And when we hear about a lot of the startup culture in the US, we talked about how, Westinghouse is not really it's not a credible rival, shall we say, in terms of its heyday to now. It's a shadow, 1/10 the workforce and capacity as previously. But then when you go like NuScale versus Rosatom, when, there's ambitions to go and build NuScale reactors in Africa, and you go, how is this little startup company that's like not even got the legacy of Westinghouse or GE or some of that sort of industrial shadow or memory or capacity going to go out there and compete? It's ridiculous. When I think about like how would we in the West compete, like it would really require unprecedented cooperation. And I think it's just not going to happen because, the French are going to build EPRs. The Americans are going to build AP1000s. The Canadians are going to build CANDOs. Maybe not, but in general, the Koreans are going to build APRs. There's enough of a, massive investment involved that you want to reap the rewards of that investment. And often that's to have some technology control. So you could imagine a world in which, we say, we're going to form this sort of, economic block, like the BRICS of the West. And we're going to, maybe we'll just pick Westinghouse and we're all going to build AP1000s and we're all going to standardize on that. And we're all going to have a big, happy kumbaya, family. And maybe we can build up some, Rosatom-like capacities, get our act together, standardize the supply chain, really start banging these reactors out, create, good financing arrangements. And compete, but like the path to getting there, to overcome the static friction, the activation energy required, let alone to build a couple more reactors in the US or Canada, let alone, trying to rival Rosatom in terms of international exports, that seems like a hard sell. And, the way that our sort of deglobalizing world is going, it's moving in the opposite direction. I talk to Europeans and they're like, how come CANDO's not bidding into like the Netherlands? Because we really, we're not so into, going with U.S. reactor vendors like Westinghouse anymore. We're a little nervous about those diplomatic ties when they want to, take Greenland from Denmark, et cetera. So monologue, rant, but yeah, anywhere you'd want to jump off from that.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. So if the U.S. or any Western country wanted to build something equivalent to Rosatom, again, remember, Rosatom didn't do it overnight. They did it over a period of a decade or so, coming from a fragmented industry. So if you wanted to build your own Rosatom, we'll just take Westinghouse as the kind of example, since they're the ones who have most recently built a large reactor. Westinghouse needs to rebuild itself from what it is now back to what it was before. It needs to reacquire construction company. It needs to acquire architect and engineering legs. It needs to acquire turbine sides. It needs to acquire civil. It needs to acquire all of these companies, or at least expertise in order to do that. Unlike the Rosatom approach, Rosatom, has all these legacy kind of companies that could be collected together under one, with one kind of directing. Westinghouse has lost all that knowledge internally, so now you need to go out to companies and try and either acquire or bring them on board. And Westinghouse, to their credit, I guess, did try and do that with the AP1000 projects in the southern U.S. They did try and go to like Chicago Bridge and Iron, which says, and Stone and Webster, and says, yeah, we built nuclear plants. It was 30 years ago, but we can do that. Never mind that all those people are retired and we don't have any of that actual knowledge anymore. But as a company, yeah, we used to do that. And to be quite blunt, it was more or less a disaster. You ended up with rework. You ended up with failed inspections, projects that go way over budget and take way too long. Same thing's happening in the UK. EDF comes in. First, the financing problems, we'll skip that with the issues with the Chinese investors, but the actual workers on the ground in the UK, again, they're in the same situation. They haven't in decades built any nuclear power plants. And so they're relearning as they go. Russia and Rosatom, they've been doing it. They send their workers all around the world. They have the experience. So if we continue our hypothetical, what do we need to do to build Westinghouse into that sort of thing? Westinghouse needs a lot of money, and Westinghouse needs a lot of expertise that just doesn't exist in the US. And the only way they can get it is by building more projects, repeating the same design or nearly the same design over and over again. That would be the AP1000. Start acquiring the companies that are required to actually do that project from end to end. And Westinghouse, as a private company, they don't have the resources to do that. Rosatom has the backing of the federal government in Russia. They have basically unlimited money coming from oil and gas that they can spend on these projects. I mean, $20 billion to build 2 nuclear plants in a foreign country. That's what? A couple of days worth of income of oil and gas for the state government. It's nothing. And it gives you this enormous leverage to be able to do these projects all over. So unless the US government is willing to step in, or, a collection of Western governments are willing to step in and say, yes, we want to form something that's going to compete against that and actually put up the money for it, it's not going to happen. And I think even in that rosy hypothetical where, okay, they agree in principle, we're going to do that. I mean, who's going to win? You're going to, the Canadians can have the INC, the UK can have the pumps, the US can have the reactor, the fuel's going to come out of Netherlands. I mean, there's no way you're going to be able to negotiate all of that across all these countries. There's going to be bickering and arguing about where the money's going and coming from. In Russia, you don't have that, right? It's one entity that decides everything, and that's how it goes.
Okay, so, in addition to hypothetical, rosy, I love that, rosy scenario where we develop Rosatom-like capabilities in the West. The big thing you need there is a rationale, right? You need to mobilize massive amounts of state resources support, have a little bit of central planning in the mix to coordinate a whole industrial ecosystem, et cetera. That's far-fetched, but perhaps if there's a rationale. Now, I think I coined this phrase, nuclear is need to have, not nice to have. You don't just say, hey, there's a lot of nuclear advocates that are just like, it's just so cool, we should just build it for fun. You generally don't even build it for climate. You build it for really hard, pragmatic reasons. You build it because the OPEC crisis triples or quadruples the price of oil, which you're burning like crazy in Europe in the 1970s. You build it in Ontario because we're importing U.S. coal. You build it in, Taiwan, Korea, and other places, Japan for fuel security reasons. There's a couple exceptions, like why did the UAE do Baraka? And from what I understand, they actually they're an oil exporter, but they import a lot of gas. And so they were offsetting some Qatari gas, I believe. Russia is kind of a puzzling one. Like, you're an oil and gas superpower. Like, why do you really need nuclear? But let's look at the U.S. I mean, they're an LNG kind of superpower now. They've got tons of domestic gas. My understanding, or my sort of crude take on Russian motives was, don't get high on your own supply. Divert that gas you might be burning as a fuel source in your own country. It's more lucrative to sell it in foreign markets. And of course, there's also this geopolitical soft power grand strategy. Do you foresee like a strong enough rationale? Like, Europe's fuel insecure in a way that the U.S. is not. But as a Western bloc, I mean, Europe's fuel secure because they just signed a deal for like 750 billion of LNG over the next like 20, 30 years from the U.S. So, like, is there a world in which there's a rationale again for the West to make the resource allocations to build our, Rosatom or Western Rosatom competition?
I
rhetorical
think
question, perhaps, but
no, but I'll give you a rhetorical answer then. So, what I see is there's actually two splits in the Western bloc, if you want to call it that. You have Europe, and Canada kind of straddles both Europe and US. I would say they're a little bit 1 foot in each pond. But Europe has real concerns. If you're in the US, you don't feel it as much, but living here in Europe, you do. That Europe is deeply concerned about climate change, and they do have real motivations from that sense. Even conservative parties in Europe, they will take a softer stance on renewables and things like that, but they're not going to outright oppose like a new solar project or wind project. They may try and divert money to other things, but they're not going to say no. It's a completely different climate to what you see in the U.S., where the current administration is actively like forbidding new wind projects from going on and throwing support for more gas, even trying to bring coal back onto the table. And nuclear projects are more seen as, in my opinion, security of supply, but also a bit of a pride thing. So you do have two different kind of viewpoints there. In Europe, again, because of the climate considerations, there is the legacy of nuclear is bad, nuclear is going to hurt all of us, what do you do with the waste? Kind of these old questions that get brought up again and again. But a lot of those are starting to go away now. So you see even Germany now, maybe we went too soon. Our grid is now, very heavily dependent on renewables, a lot of solar, a lot of wind, and it creates actual problems. We saw that in Spain a couple of months ago. There was some argument that the outage there was caused by instability in renewables, brought down everything. Germany is not making any friends in Europe right now because their high dependency on renewables means that they are importing when the sun isn't up and they have no wind and it's gray over the entire country, which can happen. I mean, it's not that big of a country. They're having to import massive amounts of energy, mostly from Sweden and the Nordic countries, the hydropower that's coming from way up north in Sweden and some of the nuclear plants. And it throws off the wholesale prices of electricity in Europe by factors of 10, 100, 1,000. And so the Swedes are like, well, what is this? Why are we getting, completely screwed over on our wholesale market prices for electricity? Because Germany decided that they wanted to have a bunch of solar panels and wind. And it creates this real problem. So when you talk about a need for baseload nuclear energy, I think Europe is in a much more realistic and strong position for wanting to go in that direction. And there are a lot of European alliances and programs that are looking to make new nuclear projects, not like, okay, let's just build more EPRs or build more AP1000s. They're a little bit more on the R&D side. Okay, we're going to do lead-fast reactor. We're going to do some other things. On the US, there really isn't that same kind of need. The US has security of energy supply. Climate is less of a concern in the US. I know in California and some other places, climate is a concern, but not to the same degree that it is in Europe. US, still is sitting on centuries worth of coal. If things get really bad in the US, they always have coal, and they will do that before they start turning off, factories and office buildings and things like that. They will start digging again, I have no doubt. So nuclear provides a bit of a kind of a bragging right, a steady supply that is clean, does provide more technology. It does provide a lot of better jobs, I would say, than what you get in the coal side or in the natural gas side. These are much more technology advanced. They're higher paying. And it is, so then once you have some experience, technology that you can then start to export. So the US's motivations aren't as strong as Europe, but the US's opposition is also much less. So it's kind of a more narrow type of thing, whereas Europe, you have a much higher need, but a much smaller or a much larger opposition to it as well.
Okay, so I think final two questions, and I think I can be brief. I don't want you to be brief because, Michael, I'm loving this. We're trolling some deep waters here, if that's the right word. Trawling, not trolling. We're trawling.
There's two L's in there.
Okay, first question. What are like the limits to what Rosatom's going to be capable of? Like simultaneously managing 15 to 20 active nuclear projects, concrete poured, in process. Why not 40? Why not 100? What's the limits? They've got 500,000 people working for them. What do you think the bottlenecks are? Finance, human resources, supply chain?
For Rosatom, and this is going to be a little bit of speculation on my part, which as long as we accept that, they will eventually run into number of personnel that can manage and oversee projects. They will eventually run into kind of classic supply chain heavy forging limits. Rosatom's biggest heavy forge, I think, is actually in Ukraine. So not exactly the most stable region. They have others, but if you lose one and you only have like 2 or 3, that severely cuts down on your ability to forge reactor pressure vessels and steam generators. So
sounds like a target for Ukrainian drones or something, right? Like seriously,
it could be. These are things that take months to construct. If you've seen, the videos of the big presses where they're coming down and bang, bang on these massive pieces of steel, it's difficult. So one of the things that will slow them down is access to these kind of upstream supply chain things. I don't think there's going to be any kind of downstream restriction in terms of either availability of fuel or in terms of customers that are interested. But upstream, they will eventually run into. Not that like handling 20 projects at once is much of a limit, I would say, but it can eventually run out. And with ongoing sanctions, arguably even the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, where they're drafting a lot of people, they may start pulling in people that would be working on construction or oversight of construction of nuclear projects, or even management of these kinds of projects, start pulling those people into military roles, which means you're now much less on your ability to support these kinds of projects. So again, a bit of speculation on my side about what's going on, but from what I've seen of what they're doing, that's I'd call it a fair assessment.
It's interesting. One of the things that like drew me to nuclear is the kind of human flourishing side of it, in terms of its high technology. People level up their education levels. Often there's vocational on-the-job training that gets, craft labor or operators up to extraordinary high levels. I have a friend who's just like a high school grad, no degree, and became a station manager, shift supervisor, and just like incredible capacity. It's a human flourishing story, but a society only has X number of highly intelligent, there's a nature and nurture side of this for sure. But, we have limited human resources in terms of numbers of like top end engineers or physicists or whatever else you want to say. And a nuclear program's awesome for harnessing that. And maybe again, on the nurture side, creating an energy environment, which fosters that in people that might not otherwise have developed it. But it does consume a certain spectrum of your, high performing human beings in your society. So clearly there's limits there. So I guess that begs the question, and I think prior to really deep diving Rosatom, I was like, oh, the Chinese have to be ahead of the Russians. And it's like, well, maybe they might be getting there. Like they're building more domestic plants than the Russians are, but they have not entered the export market in the same way. I believe just Pakistan to date, although they've been fishing. Argentina was talking about building a Hualong. I hear the UAE might be announcing something soon. We'll see. What's your sense? How long do you think it takes China to develop Rosatom-like capability? Sounds like a lot more credible than the West developing, the Rosatom stack.
I would say China is essentially already there, just not in the export market yet. China has done a lot of work, and in terms of getting their material, in terms of getting their technology ready. In a previous project, I had talked to CNNC for their fuel side, and they were very happy to show off their new fuel fabrication facility that was built, 1 year ago, and it was just starting up, and they're expanding it already. And it's state of the art, automation. I'm sure now they're integrating AI, but if you compare that to like the Tavel fabrication facility for fuel and the Westinghouse and the Framatome fuel fabrication facilities, those are all old facilities. Yes, they've upgraded the Columbia facility in the U.S., I think, is like 50 years old or more, right? It's not a new facility. They've, of course, upgraded it and made modifications, but there's only so much you can do with an old facility. Whereas if you're building a new one from scratch, you can take all of the learnings from the previous ones, and that's something that, of course, the Chinese have been very good at doing, is learning from what others have done. They are always insistent on technology transfer whenever they're buying something from the West, because they want to learn how to do it themselves, and then they want to learn how to improve it. And that's exactly what they've done. So on their side, they've taken that and they've applied it across their nuclear supply chain. And they also have vertical integration, top to bottom. They don't have a lot of uranium in their borders, so they are competing with Russia in terms of getting access to that. But as far as everything else goes, they're working up on their enrichment capacity. They're working on getting, their construction capabilities and engineering capabilities going. And domestically, they're doing very well. Them and I think South Korea are the two cheapest per megawatt in construction, and the Chinese are getting better. They do have some export now that they're trying to do. You did mention Pakistan is one. I do know they were also talking to Argentina, like you mentioned, about getting another Hualong 1 built over there. And I saw, but I didn't look into it too much, about in Uzbekistan as well. Uzbekistan said they were going to do 2 awards, one to Rosatom, which they already announced, and they were working on finalizing the one with the Chinese as well. So they are the up-and-comers. They've already built out what the West probably wants to have in place. But China, again, is in a different position. China has all these, again, supposedly private companies, semi-private companies, but these companies are backed by state banks with money. And the state, again, same as Russia, knows that it's not a free plant that we're offering you. It's a soft power political move to build a castle somewhere else and get your influence there for the next 60, 80, 100 years. And so China is really in that position now. And I would say they're probably next if Russia has some sort of difficulty from Ukraine or from anything else.
It is interesting. Like it's going to create competition where perhaps there wasn't any when, the Rosatom lot was just the go-to. I mean, it sounds like they weren't making massive extractions from a finance perspective in order to do that. They just created this like ultra good customer service model and attractive financing. But it's going to be interesting to see the Russian-Chinese competition. And I mean, if there's a real thirst for nuclear energy, having more vendors, more capacity is going to be a good thing. And it's going to be, I guess, in favor of those important countries to have a little bit of competition in the ultra good customer service nuclear model that we've been talking about for the last hour and a bit. Okay, well, this is absolutely fascinating topic, Michael. I think we touched on everything. Again, just thematically, I've had Jigar Shah on a few times. And the discourse in the US these days just seems to be a bit desperate around, well, yeah, I mean, Russians and Chinese are absolutely running laps around us and kicking our ass, but we have the best designs in the world. And there's that legacy, right? Of, I think that's kind of an probably indisputable fact that the US is the birthplace. The Russians had Orbinsk on, I think, before the US had Shippingport. But the U.S. has been a heavy hitter in terms of technology development. AP1000 is a marvel. The synthesis of a lot of PWR technology. The Japanese did great with the ABWR. But in any case, there's this kind of idea now of like, well, let's salvage our reputation. And we've just got the best, most innovative designs out there and a real focus on, I'm harsh. I call it vaporware. I call it Generation Zero. I don't think that's where the eggs need to go in the basket, but hey, it's a way to sort of superficially stay in the game, to get some press headlines and say that we're doing something, and in a sense, kind of doing the easy stuff, micro reactors, etc. This is my monologue at the end. I don't mean to draw you into controversial waters, but that's just my reflection. Is I think it was Jennifer Granholm at one point saying, this is the Russians do it with and the Chinese with state backing and that's not the American way. We harness the private sector and what is it? Private sector led, government enabled, and just more broadly speaking, and this podcast is, veered a little bit into this question of, the competing political economies of the various blocs in the world. And we're in a kind of new Cold War. I think it's pretty indisputable the political economy of the Soviet bloc and the central, state planning and the lack of economic information was, a major contributor to that collapse. Their Ladas sucked. Our Fords and Toyotas and everything else rocked. But it does feel like the West is in a state of angst over a political economy that is not competing on nuclear, that's falling behind in high tech, with China starting to really dominate a whole number of fields that are pretty important. So that's my monologue sign off. But if you have anything you'd like to add, and of course, it is not shameless to self-promote here on Decouple. I think big crossover in our audience. If it's not already there, huge potential. Absolutely love your work, and definitely going to have you back on. But feel free to take the floor for the last few minutes if you like.
I mean, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a real joy to be here. So I will just say one thing about the SMR market, or the advanced reactor market in the US, where we do have a lot of paper reactors, vapor reactors in development. It is kind of a high risk, high reward. This is how I see it, that one of these, maybe it turns out that it's remarkably easy to build, very cheap to operate, super reliable, super safe, super easy to, build it all over, much more so than the AP1000. And there is some credit, I think, to taking that risk. It's maybe not so much of a risk if you're not putting up a lot of money, like the Russians are doing. I mean, if the US government went and gave Westinghouse, unlimited funds to go and do what it wanted to, we probably would see a lot more AP1000 projects. But politically, that's really not the way to go, and not the way the US government and the US public, I would say, has been supportive. So taking a lot of these small projects, startups, that is where innovation does happen. I do hope I hope they all succeed. I know they won't, but 90% of them, 95% of them won't. I hope some of them do, and that they produce a fantastic product, that they make the new iPhone of the nuclear industry, and that it works out great. But until then, it's going to be dominated by Russia and China, large state-backed companies that have experience, that have been doing this now for a long time and have the track record to prove it. And so I will do a little bit of a shameless self-promotion here. We do have a number of videos on the Atomic Blender channel that go into some specific countries, what their current infrastructure looks like, what they're doing, what different projects that they're working on, how that's changed over the last 10 years in each of those countries. And so if you're curious about, what's going on with the UK project, I think we put that one out last year. And why that has gotten so expensive. We touched a little bit on it here, but if you want a deeper dive on that, we've got a great video on that people can check out.
Awesome. I can't resist having the last word. And I do appreciate sort of, cognitive dissonance and good arguments, good counterfactuals. I think what you mentioned, though, in terms of like the Russian sodium fast reactor program and being able to test materials, having fast spectrum neutron, to qualify fuel, et cetera, in the way like the U.S. doesn't even have the versatile test reactor. The ability to innovate in the U.S. We think because it's sort of a flexible startup system and venture capital friendly environment that translates into huge amounts of nuclear innovation. But I remain a little bit skeptical. Project Pele, I think, not unlimited funds, but getting, I believe, like hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Every year it was, they're going to be online in 23 and 24. Now official apparently is 28. And I've heard that they're having to in terms of having a gas circulation system or pump technology, if you were to put an order on the market for that, it's going to take 4 years for a supplier to design this bespoke piece of equipment for you. I've heard they're harvesting old bits of, air circulators that are lying around the INL facility. It's Frankenstein, just cobbling this together, trying to get this going. The HALEU fuel issues, we thought it was expensive. It weighed maybe a lot more. Anyway, I am preaching too much. I think we got to end this somewhere. We'll continue this conversation offline at some point, and we will have you back on. I guarantee it. It's been an absolute pleasure, Michael. Thank you for coming on Decouple.
It's been great to be here.
Today's episode was made possible through a generous donation from the Xerxes Foundation and from listeners like you making pledges on our Substack. If you'd like to join the tribe, please do head over to our Substack, smash that pledge button, or if you would like a tax-deductible receipt, you can hit the donate button and make a contribution to our fiscal sponsor. We genuinely appreciate your support. It is only through your generosity that we're able to continue to offer energy literacy on demand.